Over my years as a One Piece fan, I would often get criticized for my choices for my favorite characters in the series, specifically my favorite secondary characters in the series, as people would often tell me that they aren't properly fleshed out yet, or that we know nothing about them, and thus, they viewed my love for said characters as superficial or irrational. But I want to make the argument that limited screen time and lack of information regarding a character doesn't mean that they don't have enough to offer beyond their overall vibe. The best example of this is, I would argue, Shanks, who has been an established character since Chapter 1, and there's still so much that we do not know about him. Despite Shanks not being one of my personal favorite characters, I still think he's an excellently crafted character, and is more than deserving of the love that he gets from the fanbase despite his lack of screen time, or panel time, I guess. But I'm not here to talk about Shanks, I'm here to talk about my favorite secondary characters in One Piece and explain why I think they're great characters, despite being so sparingly used in the story. And I better do it quickly too, as all of my favorite secondary characters popped up in the current Egghead arc in some way, shape or form. And with One Piece entering its final saga, I think it's safe to assume that we will get to learn everything there is to know about these characters in the near future. So let's get right into it, starting with Monkey D. Dragon. Ever since his introduction, I've been hooked on Dragon's character. He just enters the series out of nowhere in the Locktown arc as a cloaked figure with a twisted grin on his face, casually helps Luffy escape from an inescapable situation without Luffy even realizing, and leaving me wondering, just who is this guy? What is his deal? What is his role in the story? All of these coupled with supremely interesting dialogue and hints as to what his abilities might be. One Piece is a series with a lot of mystery surrounding it, and so I think it's important for mysterious characters like Dragon to have a lot of intrigue around them. And I think that no character introduction in early One Piece is more intriguing than that of Dragon. However, I don't think that I would keep liking Dragon as much later on if it wasn't for details surrounding his actual character. After witnessing how cruel and unjust the world government is, finding out that Dragon is in charge of a revolutionary army with the purpose of going against that very government made him even more interesting and intriguing. If you really think about it, Dragon is one of the few characters in the story with such a grand selfless end goal. If you look at Luffy and the Straw Hats, they are good people and help others a lot throughout the story, but are ultimately led by their own personal aspirations and desires. Not saying that that's a bad thing, of course, as I find that aspect of the Straw Hat crew part of what makes them such a strong primary cast to begin with, but I think it's interesting when you compare them to Dragon. Judging by goals alone, Dragon might be the most selfless character in the entire series, and that is something that makes me gravitate toward his character. The moment where he saves the helpless people of Great Terminal is a personal favorite of mine, and one that I would keep rewatching non-stop when I was a kid. As far as personality goes, I find it surprising that the devious grin we saw in his introduction is a rare occasion, as in most of his scenes from that point onward, Dragon has a stern and stoic expression. He also seems to be quite intelligent, methodical, and strategic, which to be honest we don't really get to see in One Piece all that often. I find his personality to be comparable to that of Law's, since Law is also very serious and cautious, but Dragon seems to be wiser and more experienced. As a side note, however, the few scenes we saw Dragon actually smile are ones he was thinking about Luffy, and I think that makes an argument that despite being an absent father, Dragon cares for Luffy very much. That being said, you can bet I was extremely excited to see a younger Dragon pop up in Vegapunk's short flashback at Ohara. And what strikes me about that interaction is that it is mentioned that Dragon hates war. I love this detail because it hammers home the idea that Dragon isn't someone who would mindlessly start a war, yet he is the one responsible behind a large number of wars around the world. Which means that there's a lot of careful thought and dedication put into what he does, and if there was an alternative to war in his eyes, he would probably choose that. I think that every One Piece fan has one or two characters that they really like, but they don't show up in the story much, and so when they do appear for 2 panels every 200 chapters, they're just super excited to see them. For me, that character is Dragon, or at least one of them. So overall, a killer introduction, excellently handled mystery and build-up, a concrete personality, and a large role to play in the series' overall narrative and moral themes. In my opinion, there's more than enough reasons to love Monkey D. Dragon, something that I would also most definitely say for Bartholomew Kuma. Kuma's introduction was all the way back in the Jaya arc, but he didn't have his proper narrative introduction until Thriller Bark. And much like Dragon, I would argue that the intrigue behind his introduction was handled to near perfection. Kuma is introduced as a ruthless pirate who committed countless atrocities that earned him the title of a tyrant. Yet something seems off. Despite his tiring appearance, Kuma seems to be surprisingly soft-spoken and polite. I also love how calm he is. I usually gravitate towards more introverted characters that have a calmer presence, as opposed to more loud, boisterous, and reckless characters, so this is also something that makes me love Kuma so much. Seeing him keep completely composed while Moria screamed in his face is a great juxtaposition, and I find it kinda funny. Not to mention that Kuma is a straight up menace. He eradicates the Straw Hat crew in an instant, and the only reason they managed to get out of the situation is because Kuma let them go after witnessing Zoro's loyalty towards Luffy firsthand. Again, adding to the idea that he's a far kinder person than most people realize. And to top it all off, right at the end of Thriller Bark, it is implied that he has a close connection to none other than Dragon. Do you see what I mean? There is so much mystery and intrigue surrounding this character that leaves you wondering just who he is exactly, and it is all built up perfectly. Furthermore, there's a short scene later where Sengoku is yelling at Kuma because he failed to capture the Straw Hat crew, and he says something to the extent of, "I hope you didn't take pity on them just because they were injured," further reinforcing the idea that Kuma is a benevolent person. A few chapters later, Kuma reappears in the story again, only to kickstart one of the most important moments in all of One Piece, the separation of the Straw Hat crew. This moment is made a lot more interesting, however, when we later find out that Kuma was acting to the Straw Hat's best interest at the time, and that he made sure he would be able to be of service to them even long after he lost any sense of self. Talk about selflessness, mystery, and intrigue, much like Dragon. During the Reverie arc, a piece of dialogue from Sabo implies that, again, Kuma is a far kinder and gentler person than most people seem to think. And with the start of his backstory in the most recent chapter, which I'm beyond excited for, it seems that the younger Kuma is an extremely sensitive and kind-hearted kid, which might appear as a drastic contrast to how he seems to act during his introduction, but it all makes perfect sense given what we know about the character. And that's kind of my point. Despite not being particularly prominent or fleshed out, Kuma is still presented with a lot of character and personality. To the point that new information that we might learn about him won't really change how we already view him, because Oda really did a tremendous job of giving us a sense of who he is through clever pieces of dialogue and plot points. And so, despite having very few appearances throughout the story, there's still tons to love about the character. He has a distinct personality. He appears cold and ruthless, but he is in reality a gentle giant. He has some very powerful moments that communicate a great deal of kindness and selflessness, even though we might not be fully aware of his motivations quite yet. And it's all topped off with an extremely eerie and mysterious presence that just grabs your attention every time he appears. Even before we get his full backstory, Kuma is still a tremendous character, not to mention how he seems to have been a bit of everything you can be in the world of One Piece. He's introduced as someone who is a loyal agent to the government even though he used to be a horrific pirate, but it turns out he has been one of the most influential figures of the Revolutionary Army all along. And on top of that, it seems that he grew up as a slave who later managed to become a king of an entire nation? I mean, if that isn't interesting, I don't know what is. Oh wait, I do. Because even if Kuma is interesting, I would argue that no One Piece character is more interesting than Kuzan. So I think it's clear by now that I enjoy the moral aspects of One Piece's story a lot. Kuma and Dragon are two of my favorite characters because they're driven by kindness, selflessness, and a clear sense of right and wrong, something that I very much admire. Likewise, some of my favorite villains in One Piece have their own distinct moral ideologies. And something that I love about One Piece is that despite its simplicity, it does a great job at blurring the lines of what is right and what is wrong. Enter Kuzan, a character who is very much driven by doing what he considers to be right, but justifiably has trouble understanding what right even means. But I will get to that later. During his introduction in the Long Ring Long Land arc, he's shown to be a laid-back and lazy man, which I gotta appreciate being a lazy boy myself. Something that seems a little strange given the fact that he's supposed to be one of the 3 admirals of the Navy headquarters, one of the greatest powers in the entire world. He says he follows his own sense of lazy justice, which at first seems like a humorous gag to add to the idea that he's lazy, but as we'll come to know, there's a lot more to that. After proceeding to completely annihilate the Straw Hats but ultimately letting them go, before revealing his connection to other characters that we already know, he appears in the story again through Robin's flashback that gives a lot more insight into who he is as a person. During his youth, he seemed to have been way more dedicated to the cause of the Marines, but witnessing the complete destruction of an entire island kinda shifts your perspective a little bit, doesn't it? In the same flashback, he drops one of my favorite lines in all of One Piece that sums up his entire character. The thing called justice changes its shape depending on where you stand. In other words, he's just such an interesting character. He takes multiple conflicting actions throughout the story, and it seems to be because he doesn't really know what he believes in anymore or what he considers justice. Therefore, he does his job in a lazy manner, as he lost any passion and dedication he might have had for serving the cause of the Marines in the first place. His character only becomes more interesting after the time skip, where he abandons his duty as a Marine and enters a journey of reflection and self-discovery, I guess. And I mean, come on, look at that rip! He seems to have allied himself with the Blackbeard pirates, and after the more recent chapters, a lot of people are worried that my boy turned to the dark side. But I urge you to keep trusting Oda, as he has implied multiple times that there is something very specific that this man wants to do, and that despite everything, he is still himself. And I cannot wait to see where his character goes in the future. Like I said, the moral themes of One Piece and the distinction between right and wrong has always been one of my favorite things about One Piece, and there is no character that tackles those themes better than Kuzan in my opinion. So to sum up, thematically, he's easily one of One Piece's best, and he's made even better by his extremely entertaining personality. He strikes a perfect balance between serious and goofy. He's stoic and skeptical, but he's also lazy and forgetful. I'm hooked every time he shows up, and I hope he keeps delivering in the future.